Do we practice democratic exceptionalism? Do we continue to practice it in countries like Egypt, Pakistan, and others? And is that an issue? Do we look the other way? Let's look at foreign policy as I try to bring this to a close. What do we see when we look at issues of foreign policy? On the one hand, we see President Obama coming into office and it seeming to be a breath of fresh air for him. Obama surprises people from his inaugural address to his speech in Ankara. I met him in Turkey when he was giving that speech, or right after he gave the speech, to his speech in Cairo. And Obama sets out a new vision. He says that America has to return to its principles and values. Very interesting, because that's exactly what Ronald Reagan said. If some of you remember I remember watching, I'm a lifelong Democrat, so I was watching Ronald Reagan, but I'm a lifelong Democrat who voted for Barry Goldwater. Pick Nixon over Kennedy, and Catholic. So you can't, I'm an erratic personality. My politics are very erratic. There is a president that I've been criticized as being too influential with regard to him, and I never even voted for him as president, so it's very hard to predict where I come down. But I was watching Ronald Reagan that night, and I remember all of a sudden saying to myself, my God, I feel so good. He did this acceptance speech. And I thought, was it the second martini? Or what could it be? And what it was, if you go back and look at Reagan's speech, he basically said, America, we have our people held hostage, our economy's down the toilet. He didn't use that phrase. He wasn't sophisticated enough to use Brooklyn language. He said, but we can be strong again. All we have to do is remember that we've moved away from our principles and values, that we have a strong need to reclaim them. And in effect, in his own way, Obama was saying that he distanced himself from the Bush legacy. He talked about the fact that we were going to be multilateral, not unilateral, that we were going to realize that you don't just use strength, you have to use diplomacy as well, that you don't get people's respect by simply overpowering them. He talked about reaching out to the Muslim world and rebuilding bridges. He was also smart enough to talk about economic and educational development in very specific terms. Now, one can now say how much of that has remained vision, rather than delivering the beef. But the point is, the president saw the importance of, if you will, dealing with a public diplomacy, but one in which, if you look at his Cairo speech, he not only demonstrated a singular sensitivity to Islam itself and distinguished between mainstream Islam, extremists, to the American Muslim experience, to Islamic history, but also to the fact that public diplomacy was not just about making nice. The public diplomacy was also about foreign policy. Not meaning that we had to say we were going to change all our foreign policy, but to recognize that we had problems in the way that we conducted foreign policy. We were going to re-examine it and try to operate in a more productive fashion. So he talked about even dealing with those that had clenched fists, if they were willing to. What he didn't deal with was those that had iron fists in velvet gloves, Mr. Mubarak of Egypt and many others, which are an issue. But he did deal with all of that. He recognized the need to address these issues. But what does this really mean in terms of concrete challenges? It means that the temptation to continue to respond or to listen to those that always want a military response has to be resisted. The problem we have is Guantanamo is supposed to be shut. It's not shut down. It's supposed to move to civilian trials, and now looks like Congress may actually opt for military tribunals. That's going to send the wrong kind of message. Remember, in Iran, under the Shah, and in other countries, we often, and in Iraq, we would talk about exempting our soldiers. Didn't matter about the other people, from tribunals there. They all had to be tried at home. Why? Because we didn't feel that local tribunals, and particularly military tribunals, would be all that fair. But we're going to reassure everybody else that if we have military tribunals, and we don't operate by our standard regulations, that it is going to be fair. Obama inherits two major catastrophic situations, Iraq and Afghanistan, and discovers that no matter what he says, we've got two countries that are occupied. in two countries that are fragile. And so on the one hand, you want an exit strategy, but, you know, how do you get out and still not leave and have the whole thing fall apart and get blamed for it? So you figure out how you're going to juggle the balls in Iraq, and that's not clear at all. Iraq is still very fragile. And Afghanistan is horrendous. There is no security in Afghanistan. You barely have security in the capital. And the security for Karzai is not provided by Afghans. It's provided by American forces and by Blackwater types. You know, massive numbers of those. And having said that we're going to think about exit strategies, we then determined that we've got to put in another 30,000 troops. Well, you know, the problem with 30,000 troops, and I think that Crystal and Petraeus are trying to deal with that, is you don't want to put in 30,000 troops with the idea that you're just going to up the number of military, and it's going to be primarily for military action. It's got to be that you reach out to communities. More and more communities have to see you as providing them protection, and also that you're going to train their army and police so you can lead. If you're just putting in more bodies to fight, all you're doing is escalating the numbers of fighters, which means you're going to escalate the number of deaths, which means you're going to escalate the number of drone attacks, and read your headlines from today. You know, the downside of drone attacks is that often you make a lot of enemies. If many in Pakistan are now turning against the Pakistan Taliban because they've now become victims, how much more so will they turn against the Americans if, because of an increased American presence, you wind up not just with the extremists being killed, but lots of civilians or collateral damage taking place? That's a challenge for the administration. An equally strong challenge is the ability to engage with mainstream opposition. How do you do that with authoritarian regimes that don't suffer any mainstream opposition and that basically say you shouldn't talk to them? And particularly, how do you deal with mainstream Islamic movements when most authoritarian Muslim regimes fear these mainstream Muslim movements? Not because they're terrorists. They have terrorist groups. They're mainstream. They fear them because they're worried about, if you opened up the political system, how well they might do. And even if they didn't come to power, how strong they could be as an opposition. And so they want to crush them. And so their line to the United States is, don't get in the way. Well, you know, what do we do with that? We took a tough line with Uzbekistan for a while, and Uzbeks basically said you can pull your bases out. So now we look the other way. In Uzbekistan, do you know how they handle their opposition? It's not exaggerated. They boil them in oil, in hot oil. I mean, they throw people into hot oil. So, I mean, this is... So, we're dealing with a very mixed bag here, and that's the difficulty the president faces. We have to continue to have a military option, but to emphasize diplomacy. If you're dealing with an Ahmadinejad that provokes, well, that's fine. The question is, can you handle it? I often kid, you know, I give talks sometimes, and they have security there. In some of the places I speak. And I'll often say, well, don't worry, they'll say to people, don't worry, we have a lot of security. If something happens, we'll just usher them out. I'll say, you don't have to run from Brooklyn. I'll just jump over the table and punch them out. Now, I'm nonviolent. I learned that as a kid. I took somebody on. All I remember is banging my head on the curb. From that moment on, I do not believe in fighting. It's not worth it. But the reality of it is, with an Ahmadinejad, our instinct always, you know, particularly from my point of view, from the right, whether it's Republican or Democrat, is to talk about the kind of military option. It's sort of like, who do they think they are? You know, they say something we find offensive, so we're going to do something about it. Well, you know, our Secretary of State winds up telling the Iranians that she's sure that the military are probably going to try to take over from Khamenei and others. You could see why there might be some Iranians who would get upset. Or we refuse to recognize the fact that how different Iranians are, however much they're against the regime. Iranians are generally united on Iran's right to have a nuclear capability. And so the best way to mobilize Iranians in terms of Iranian nationalism is to simply say, no, you may not have it. It's like we said it to the Pakistanis. India can have it. Israel can have it. And they don't even allow us and allow international organizations to even go in and examine what they have. But they can have it. But you can't have it. And so part of the challenge to the administration is, how do you balance the issue of